2023 hasn't exactly been a peaceful year, and the game industry is no exception. Getting any one person to adopt a universal consensus on Game of the Year is like trying to define the borders of Palestine, only more divisive and violent. So in many ways, it was refreshing to see how many gamers rallied so totally around Baldurs Gate 3 as the new gold standard for the game industry. The idea of a gold standard isn't exactly new. In any artistic medium, there have always been works so universally well received that many start to laud them as the template for all others. In theatre, you can't go 3 without a play being described as Shakespearean. In the film industry, actors and directors continue to hang class acts like Citizen Kane and Rashomon on a pedestal above all others. In music, legends like R. Kelly are held captive in the popular consciousness and in prison. And the game industry isn't really any different. In the press and popular debates, there have always been calls for titles to be placed above others as the best in class. But in my lifetime, I can't remember these calls forming such a symphonic chorus until the release of Baldurs Gate 3.
And the game of the year is Baldurs Gate 3.
Nothing about Baldurs Gate's rise was conventional or expected. It combines several aspects rarely seen together: CRPG game design, AAA budget, and lengthy period of early access. And yet, to the surprise of many, marched onto the gaming arena with a bang of the bare variety, becoming an astounding critical and commercial success, managing to bag a Steam score of 96%, a Metacritic rating of 96, and according to Business Insider, managing to sell up to 27 million copies. Partly this remarkable success comes down to the excellent marketing of its studio Larian. Not many games let you bear out your burdens on a literal bear, but as anyone who's played through it can attest, this is the sort of game that speaks for itself. Each component of its complex machinery fits together with a level of craftsmanship and finesse that transcends the limitations of its CRPG niche. The voice acting, for one, is not only near perfect, but is complemented by writing that fleshes out protagonists with a remarkable level of nuance and equal dosage of flair, effectively managing to bring manufactured identities to vivid life. Moreover, this fascinating cast of characters come together in a game world that does more to realize the original promise of tabletop RPGs than any modern RPG. You see, in the world of Faerun, much like Dungeons & Dragons tabletops, the ball's in your court. Decisions, both narrative and tactical, are left up to you, testing the extent of your creativity and wisdom. But the true magic of the game is that, as with life, the ramifications of your choices unveil in ways completely outside of your control. One of my favorite non-narrative moments, so no spoilers, don't freak out, is in Act 3. Now I won't say who, but one of your potential allies gets captured and rigged to a set of oil-covered barrels a few turns away from bursting into flame. Now in most games you'd have to balance fighting the enemies around you while engaging in a race against time to extract your ally, but not in Baldurs Gate 3. Instead of doing any of that, I just moved the guy. Using my telekinetic abilities, I threw my ally to safety on the first turn of combat, and then ruthlessly battered his foes at my own speed. So it's no wonder then that its release was followed by a chorus of gamers and journalists all around the world hailing Baldurs Gate 3 as the new gold standard for RPGs and gaming as a whole. It not only satisfied the yearning of gamers for a synthesis between strategy and constant banging, but seemingly provided a great commercial model for up-and-coming developers fearful of removing themselves from the current trends of in-game monetization, price hikes, and simplification of player choice. But, and here comes the controversial part you've been waiting for, I believe that just because Baldurs Gate 3 is undeniably great, perhaps even a 10 out of 10, does not make it a blueprint for the industry, even within the RPG genre, because such a notion is inherently ridiculous regardless of the games. Now, it's no secret that during the height of the gold standard conversation, anti-gold standard takes mostly emphasized how difficult it was to actually replicate Baldurs Gate 3. One of the most prominent and, in my opinion, smart takes on this issue was articulated by Danny O'Dwyer. In his This Is Why Games Like Baldurs Gate 3 Are So Rare for A16Z Games, O'Dwyer argues that the discourse around the idea of a gold standard greatly simplifies what actually goes into creating masterpieces like Baldurs Gate 3. He argues that works like Baldurs Gate 3 are usually the product of perhaps, at the very least, years and usually decades of iterative learning. There are a few examples of studios suddenly picking masterpiece out of thin air, and so the idea that any game can act as a model for others drastically oversimplifies the difficulty of replicating a Baldur's Gate 3. Larian, for one, its studio, only got to Baldur's Gate 3 after perfecting a distinct formula through decades of experimentation, learning, and gradual continual improvement. Click 4 Gameplay does a great job of showing this in his history of Larian. But you don't need to watch an extensive guide on their history to get it. Just play an hour of Divinity Original Sin, and you'll see how the rough ideas or unvarnished features introduced in that game were slowly polished on the way to Baldur's Gate 3. Therefore, the chance a non-Larian studio could even attempt to exactly replicate their formula is dubious at the very least. But my reasoning for why the idea of a gold standard just doesn't hit the mark comes from a different place. Namely, my understanding of trade-offs in the game development process. As I've already explained, the model of iterative development favored by most devs enables systems created in a period of experimentation to be perfected over time. But this method also comes with a flip side that makes it very difficult to establish a universal blueprint. It enshrines certain trade-offs established by the initial formula forever. I'll explain what I mean. Without unlimited resources and expertise, all devs have to make some difficult choices on what to prioritize and what to not. This often results in a focus on that which makes their games most distinctive over features that will not fundamentally impact the player experience enough to be considered. And it's not as simple to rectify this as hiring the best open world designer or character animator, because expertise is often formed on a culture-wide level. Therefore, even when coming up with new experimental systems, trade-offs have to be established and eventually permanently enshrined when these new ideas are accepted as a foundation from which a studio will build on. For starters, the design of Faerun in Baldur's Gate 3 isn't particularly distinctive or imaginative. Most areas have a limited color palette, the environments and character models both mirror very generic fantasy tropes, Mind Flayers are just mini Cthulhus, and the city itself looks like Florence with large toy soldiers everywhere. But we don't care, not because we have low standards, because we accept it for what it is. A trade-off from the Divinity Original Sin blueprint that enabled Larian to expend their time and effort working out how to bring the level of freedom and creativity found within tabletop formulas to life. Now, I'm sure some of you might be thinking, even at this point, if this is true for Baldur's Gate 3, how can you call it a masterpiece or 10 out of 10? If the philosophy that underpins its game design comes with inherent limitations? Well, because this is not how I view perfection. In fact, I'll go even further. This is an impossible standard for perfection. As having a supermodel level of beauty comes with crippling depression, extreme body image issues, and a life of eating only lettuce with MBA dressing, so can a perfect game, absent of any imperfections, be an impossible standard. So I think we have two choices, honestly. Either we say that games are inherently imperfect, perfection is an impossible standard, or we lower the standards for a perfect game or a masterpiece. Perfection doesn't have to mean everything is 100% flawless. Rather, in my view, it should only refer to that which is so expertly crafted that the experience it produces is irreplaceable. And this is why I have a problem with the gold standard narrative. It's fundamentally based on the assumption that objectivity is a possible standard and is used more so as a tool to attack other developers than it is to actually improve standards in the industry. I'll give you a brilliant example of this. Just look at the public treatment of Bethesda versus Larian. Now, it's no secret that Bethesda is in a bit of trouble after releasing a $70 loading screen simulator with a space theme. But I nonetheless still haven't completely given up on them, and recently I decided to make the mistake of expressing this view in a public forum. You see, in my view, outside of Starfield, it's very difficult to find much evidence that Bethesda is simply too incompetent to create quality titles. What the internet simply sees as a weakness, their one-sided appeal, is in fact a product of their distinctive style. In the same way Larian prioritizes personalizing their playthroughs with a spider web of interweaving choices and consequences, Bethesda puts their open worlds on a pedestal. But my problem with this whole Bethesda is broken reasoning isn't just that it's flawed, it's that the flaws in its reasoning lead many to misdiagnose exactly why, for example, Starfield didn't work for Bethesda fans and Baldur's Gate really worked for CRPG fans. And it all comes down to Bethesda's overzealous attitude to risk. In creating the gargantuan universe of Starfield, Bethesda simply went way too far out of their lane. As I said before, it's natural that devs won't get things completely right when implementing new ideas for the first time. So to mitigate risk, they should make sure there's a foundation of quality that limits how far the overall player experience can suffer if the new features just don't work. But with Starfield, Bethesda didn't do any of this. They embraced the crack mentality and decided to completely recharge their formula for a new IP, and in the process abandon what defined their appeal in the first place. Whereas Larian were more careful of their innovation and as a consequence far more successful in implementing new ideas. They didn't abandon their identity. I've been playing too much Baldurs Gate recently, and take a ridiculous leap into the dark, but instead cautiously improved on what they knew with plenty of player feedback. But gold standard thinking would cause you to come to the opposite conclusion. You'd imagine that Starfield failed because Bethesda's formula is objectively broken and Larian's is objectively not. And so to revive themselves from the dead, Bethesda should learn to be less like Bethesda and more like Larian, beginning with a purge of veteran devs like Emil Pagliarulo. But this logic replicates the very thinking that produced Starfield in the first place. Starfield wasn't disliked by fans because it was too Bethesda. It was badly received because it wasn't Bethesda enough. The same fans that lapped up every Bethesda title didn't suddenly grow tired of the studio's methodology and want more complex narrative storytelling. They were angered by the execution, not the concept. But if you're stuck in this objective quality mindset, thinking about gold standards all the time, you'll never understand that the reason you don't like a Bethesda game and you do like Baldurs Gate 3 is a product of a subjective value judgment. You simply prefer the trade-offs Larian decide to make over the ones Bethesda lie about. This interview with veteran ex-Bethesda developer Bruce Neesmith really sums things up. As he puts it, referring to Baldurs Gate 3, they've only come out and said, quite bluntly, we don't care if 1% of players will ever see this. Those 1% that do are going to be happy, and they will tell the other 99% who will then be happy that the option existed. Whereas at Bethesda, the games we were making were so big, we had to take the approach of, well, everybody's got to be able to do this at some point. We can't lock off content that way, and you can see it in our games. We don't. You can get to be the heads of all the guilds, you can be friends with all the companions, you can go to all these places. Nothing is off limits, end quote. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Otherwise,